So my name's Penelope Bell. I'm in Seattle, Washington, and I am absolutely delighted to be with my beloved friend Howard Ross. Howard and I met over 20 years ago. We were co-founders of a workshop called the Inner Journey Seminars, and it was a 3.5-day intensive residential workshop. Some of the people on the call actually got to participate in. And we really dove deep into all the energies in all humans of the masculine and the feminine. And then we had men and women separated into different camps, and they did deep work opening up all of those energies because all humans have them. And then we would bring the groups together for healing between men and women. And it changed my life forever. I had the privilege to learn and be taught along Howard. It's like my big brother. And we're forever friends. So when it was about a week and a half ago, it was like, okay, what do we need to do? We need to start doing White Allies work. I texted him and said, would you please do something with me? And you're always such a generous yes. I'm so grateful for that. Thank you for saying yes, for all the work that you've done. I'm going to hand it over to Howard in just a minute. I'm just going to give you guys what the flow of the day is going to be. Howard's going to be doing some contextualizing teaching around what it is that we're in and how we've been set up, and start thinking about different ways to approach the Black Lives Movement, how to really become an anti-racist, which is active racism. And my whole background is in psychology and the neuropsychology of action, and what is it that we have to face in order to not go numb and go away, so that we can keep leaning in as white allies and interrupting the injustice that's happening for so many people of the global majority. And then I'm going to break you into think and listen groups. There will be 3 of you in a room, and you'll each get 5 minutes to just talk and listen to each other. Because one of the things that needs to happen is that so many of us have gotten very confused and very humiliated. And I'll talk more about that later. But I want you guys to be able to keep your highest mind available, which means being able to discharge and talk and think together. So Howard, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thanks, appreciate it. Hi, everybody. Just one other logistic thing, and that is if when we do get the point to sharing, if it's possible to have your screen on, even if you don't have it on the whole time, if it's possible to have your camera on, it's nice to see people when they're sharing. If you can't do that, it's fine, but it just adds a little bit. So good. Well, I'm glad to be with you. I was just telling Penelope, it's been kind of a remarkable last 10 days because it feels like the whole world is screaming to take a look at this issue in ways that are really very different than they have been. I've been doing this work. I've been paid for doing this work in organizations for 35 years, but went to my first civil rights meeting 50 years ago when I was 15 years old. So this has been kind of my whole life's work. And it's really this last incident, I think, this George Floyd killing, I think was something that everybody woke up to in a way that we haven't seen, I think largely because just how ghastly it was, and that we sit there for 9 minutes and watch the life seep out of a human being. It's and I think that like the rest of you, I'm sure I find my feelings cascading between grief and anger and frustration and rage. And and rage is a particular quality because it's, a lot of times we don't realize that rage is not just anger, it's anger mixed with a certain sense of resignation and hopelessness. I think that, and you hear people talking about, well, why would people, why would people burn their own homes or their own city? And there are a couple answers to that. One, which is most people don't own that property. And that's one of the problems, is that people live in communities where they can't possibly even afford to own it. But the other is because I think we've all had times in our life when we were in so much pain that we just struck out sort of mindlessly or irrationally. And that's really the feeling that people have. So what I'd like to do to start is just create some context, not like it's truth, because I'm still learning. I've been an ally my whole life and I'm still learning, and I'm always painfully aware that no matter how much I study, no matter how many things I read or write, and no matter how many people I've been with, I'm still white. And I just want to start with a kind of to tell one on myself as an example of that. About 7 years ago, I live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., the other Washington. And about 7 years ago, I was driving down into the city, and I live right next to 16th Street, which goes right to the White House, literally from my house. And it's about 30 minutes down right through a part of Washington that's sometimes called the Gold Coast, because it's a upper class, wealthier, and whiter part of the city. And it was a beautiful, warm day, and I had the top down in the convertible I had at the time, and I pulled up to a stoplight, and a young African-American man walked in front of me with his hat on backwards and a loose shirt and baggy pants. And the best way I can say it is my hand blocked the door. And the reason I say it that way is because it was a completely irrational act. The top was down in my convertible. It offered me no safety. It was just a reflexive action. And as soon as it happened, I looked at my hand and said, where the fuck did that come from? Excuse my language. And he actually heard the car lock and stopped in the street, maybe 10, 12 feet from me, and turned around and put his hand on his hip and just looked at me with disgust. And I, feeling embarrassed and ashamed, I immediately apologized, and he thanked me with a particular digit of his hand and then continued to walk away. And I sat there feeling shame and guilt for long enough so that the people behind me started to honk and tell me to get moving. And of course, at some point I realized that I didn't choose that feeling. I didn't choose that reaction. It just came up, almost like E4 got pressed on my personal little jukebox, and that occurred. And I'm sure that most people who are on this call have had some example of that at some place in their life. You had a thought, a feeling, or a reaction come up. So I want to start in that context to say that this isn't about being perfect. This is about how do we learn more about ourselves and about the system that we're a part of, because we've all been trained to play that role in the system. You know, the last week, I know some of you know that the Governor Walz of Minnesota and President Trump, I think on the same day, both tweeted something like, these protests are no longer about George Floyd. And they were trying to draw attention to people who were creating havoc, but they in a bizarre way, they were right, because the protests were never about George Floyd. George Floyd was just a trigger to something that's deep in our culture. And archetypically, those of us who are white remain pretty clueless about these dynamics. We know that there are bad issues, and when bad people rather, and when issues like this emerge, or when incidents emerge like this George Floyd incident, we see them as a series of terrible incidents. And I'm not talking now about extreme racists or people who, like that. I'm talking about most of us. We see this and we say, oh, that's terrible what happened. Those policemen have to be held accountable. And whoever shot Philando Castile has to be held accountable. And whoever killed Sandra Bland or arrested Sarah, they need to be held accountable. And Tamir Rice. And we go back and back and back all through this list, this pantheon of people who've been killed. And we see them mostly as individual circumstances that keep happening. And we wonder why these individual circumstances keep happening. But to African Americans, they see it very differently. To African Americans, rather, this is the personal lived experience every day of their lives. They wake up in the morning and send their children out to school wondering if it's going to be the last time they see them. And that's not extreme. They know 500 incidents like the George Floyd incident that didn't end up being on camera, or didn't lead to the person dying, or maybe it was just being harassed or beat up or treated harshly or denied an opportunity or something like that. I was working with Fannie Mae a number of years ago, doing some consulting work with Fannie Mae, and one of the leaders of the company was an African-American man who made more than $500,000 a year and lived in a very upper-class community here in the suburbs. And he told me the story. He said his son was home one summer from school, and staying with him living with the family during the summer. And he would borrow his father's car. His father had a very expensive car. I don't know, I forget what it was. And he said in that one summer, that 2 months or 2.5 months, his son was stopped 4 times by police officers coming in and out of his own home community, because they saw this young black man driving this expensive car in this predominantly white upper-class suburban community, and they just assumed he was a drug dealer. And he said his greatest fear was that his son at some point would have had enough of it and would explode in anger and end up dead. for driving in and out of his own community. So it's like, I like to say to people, when these things happen, it's not personal. It's like a rainstorm. We're out in a rainstorm. We get personally very wet, but it's not a personal rainstorm. It's actually a function of systemic racism that's built into our society. And it's built into our society from the very foundation. Before we had America, we had American racism. It's been now 401 years since the first slaves came to this country. And we have to understand, I'm not going to go into a whole history of African-American history or anything like that, but just at a very simple level to say that the distinction of race was created because it served a purpose. James Baldwin famously said, and, I could do nothing but quote James Baldwin all day and we would all be better for it. But James Baldwin once said that America created, and he used the N-word, I won't say that word, but he said America created that being. And we needed to create that being because in order to justify in our minds the notion of building an entire society that's filled on free slave labor, you can't do that if you treat those people as human beings. The conscience simply won't allow it. And so in order to do that, we create people as less than us. We make them 3/5 in the Constitution. We make it illegal for them to read, to grow, to learn, to have family structures that are of any strength and sustainability. And all of that serves an economic purpose because then you can reduce people to, it's a little bit like, we have a farm, Leslie and I have a farm, and our neighbor has cows on our property because we have more land than he does. And so we let him use the land for his cows. And one day I said to him, what are the cows' names? And he said, they're beef cattle. They don't have names. And I said, what do you mean, Buck? They don't have, what does that have to do with it? He said, because you eat beef cattle. I said, you don't want to eat something you've named. So it's very, we shift. And so that's part of our culture. And so what happens is we create this dominant, non-dominant narrative. And the narrative is that we're better than, which means we have more rights than, we have more opportunities than, we have more privilege than, we're seen as better than, we're seen as smarter than, more capable in so many ways. And in order to substantiate that narrative, we then have to create structures and systems in our society that reinforce it. And so we have, laws that allow certain people to do certain things and other people not. We have, we say that certain people can get loans and other people can't, that certain people get to be represented in ways that other people don't, that, certain people get jobs that other people don't get. And of course, occasionally we throw in an exception to that rule. And that allows us to feel like, well, maybe it's not as bad as we thought. So many of us remember after President Obama was elected that we were supposedly going into post-racial America. How did that go, right? And those structures and systems then reinforce the dominant narrative by creating differential outcomes. So a great example of this is the stop and search laws, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, that they had in New York City, which allowed police officers to stop somebody who they deemed as suspicious. And I'm sorry, somebody's calling me. I will decline that. To stop people who they felt was suspicious. So when they studied the impact of those laws, 90% of the people who were stopped were either Black or Latinx people. Only 48% of the people in the city were in those groups. So roughly twice as many people were stopped as were in those groups. And of course, the justification is, well, that's more criminals come from that area. But you can see if you stop twice as many people, you're likely to catch more criminals. So we can see the cyclical nature of how this works. And then when the poor performance comes out, we say, well, you see, this justifies the dominant and non-dominant structure we set up, and this cycle continues on and on and on. Voting rights disparities or redlining or limited access to loans or access to education or healthcare disparities and the like. All of that produces these inequitable outcomes. And no place have we seen this system play out more than over the last several months with COVID pandemic is concerned. Because as most of you know, I'm sure African Americans are suffering roughly twice as many as their percentage of the population are both contracting the disease and dying. But there are all kinds of factors that lead to that. So socioeconomic factors, as an example. We know that average African American family has roughly 1/7 the acquired wealth of white families, and African Americans on average also earn less money per capita. So that means they tend to live in lower income areas, mostly lower income urban areas. Lower income urban areas, people have older cars, which produce more pollution. They have city buses, which also produce more pollution. And where are the bus depots? Almost always in those very communities. And so people are in these communities in which the pollution level is worse, which therefore makes their lungs more susceptible to a respiratory disease. Or we look at policing and know that there is systemic bias in policing. Actually, the poll that came out just yesterday showed that 69% of Americans now believe that there's systemic bias, racial bias in policing, which is, to give you a sense of comparison, is up 50% from what it was after Ferguson, which is a huge breakthrough that most Americans now see that. So more blacks end up in prisons, and prisons, again, are a petri dish for COVID right now. And it's important also when we talk about this to realize that even as we talk about this, where race is concerned and trying to develop our sensitivity, that sexism and gender bias shows up in that, because in all this pantheon list, we don't talk about Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor and all the African American women who also have died due to these same kinds of practices. So all of that leads to health disparities on the part of African Americans, and I'm sure many people know that African Americans have worse health outcomes in virtually every major illness, biases and assumptions and beliefs that we all have. They get reinforced. The way the mind works is we think we're rational, but what we've learned in our research is that we're more rationalizing than we are rational as human beings. And so, once you have an attitude that somebody is good and another person is bad, or somebody is better than, you begin to automatically gather the evidence to support that point of view. And so we gather the data that shows why we're better, and particularly when we're a part of that group. We know that the everyday logistics of people's lives contribute to this. Whether or not people have access. People who live, for example, in inner city environments in food deserts where you can't get fresh food. You can't get, many of us are taking care of protecting ourselves against this virus by building up our immune systems. But if you don't have access to the information about that, or access to even buying what you need relative to healthy food, products, supplements, things like that, then you don't have access to that protection. And then, of course, the ultimate psychological impact of all of this, which is leaving people feeling less than, leaving people feeling unsafe on a daily basis. I think that the thing that's hard for many of us who are white to get is how frightening it is on a daily basis, minute by minute basis, to be African American in our culture, because one of the traps of racism is we've created the victim to seem like the predator. We have projection that Black people don't feel as much pain as we feel. And there's research that comes from social scientists all around the country and medical schools that show that, for example, doctors prescribe less pain for the same ailments for African Americans as they do for white people, even when it's pediatric, even when it's children we're talking about. And so this image of the big, strong, frightening Black man who's going to come and get us, or even the angry Black woman who's going to come and get us, is deeply embedded into our structures and systems. And, it's funny, it came up this morning, somebody posted something that they were showing Gone with the Wind as some kind of, a lot of people are doing these sort of film festival kinds of things on their own with people, since we're mostly still staying home. Gone with the Wind, if you look at it, whether you like the film or not, is a paean to racism. I mean, it's Hattie McDaniel was touted as this great racial breakthrough film because Hattie McDaniel won the Academy Award, but she was forced by the studio, when she accepted the award, to talk about being proud of being a credit to her race for playing the happy slave in this movie. So many of our iconic moments in American history are embedded with racism that's under the surface. The language I like to use is that it's concealed by its obviousness. It's so present that we don't even see it. And privilege is like that for those of us who are white. Privilege allows us to not have to pay attention to that stuff. And it allows us to not see the things that we do that others can't do, or the things that we don't have to do that others can do. Another example, I've got 4 sons, the youngest of whom is 26. So I've taught all of them to drive, but never once had to have a conversation with any of them about driving while white. And yet every African-American parent I know, and I know a lot, has had that conversation with their kid when they get their driver's license. If a police officer stops you, keep your hands visible. all the time, move very slowly, ask permission before you even reach to get a Kleenex, make sure you make eye contact, but not too much eye contact, be nice and pleasant, even if they're being rude and offensive, and pray that my kid gets home alone. Oprah is doing a remarkable thing right now, and she did the first one last night. There's going to be another one on her network, on OWN Network, where she's talking about race with a number of extraordinary Black leaders from all walks of life. And last night, she had on the mayor of, oh, thank you. Somebody just said, be careful with my microphone. Sorry, I'm gesticulating too much. The mayor of Atlanta is an African-American woman, and she was saying, when the shit hit the fan, she said to her son, this is the mayor of a major American city, said to her son, I can't protect you out there. You need to remember that you're not the mayor's son out there, you're a Black man. Think about that, the mayor of an American city. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Penelope. And before we're done, I'll share some thoughts with you about things that we can do to be more active allies. But I don't want to jump to the end before we get a chance to really dive in.
Right. So there's some questions that have been coming up on the chat. One of the questions, and this is something I've been running into, all of us have been, it's like people are really confused. White people in particular, extremely confused about what racism is. So there's this thing about reverse racism or everybody's racist. And the more I've dove into like really deeply understanding what's going on here, really me finally getting that this is a white person's, we're racist. And this is an implant, as we didn't choose it. None of us chose, like, literally the mental implants that we're dealing with. It's just, It's maddening. It's a mental health issue. But the question that came through the chat is, could you please define racism as a distinction?
Sure, absolutely. It's an important distinction. So I'll look at it in terms of three terms. So first of all, we have bias. And we know that bias is simply an automatic preference that our brains have to one thing versus another. It's designed for us to survive, so we can quickly determine what we need to do about a certain circumstance. It's a shortcut so that we don't have to wander. This is something I've studied and written about. And so, if you think about it, you walk across the floor every day in your room, you don't stop to check every step because you've learned over time that floors hold your weight. But if even one time you would step on the floor and hit a spot where actually the rug had nothing under it and you went through to the next floor, the next times you walked across floors, you would be much more tentative. Or if any of you have ever been burned by a stove, you know what it's like for several weeks before you get near the stove, you're very tentative because you've had that experience. So one function of bias is it helps us move through life quickly. Another function is that it keeps us safe. So it helps us spot something or someone who's dangerous before they get to us. If somebody comes walking like this towards you with their fists clenched, your brain immediately says this is potential danger. And so bias in itself is simply a function of the brain that can sometimes help us and sometimes have dramatic consequences. Now, when we have a consistent bias against a particular group of people that leads to behavior, we call that prejudice. And prejudicial behavior is something that any human being can have. And, you could be white and prejudiced against Black people. You can be Black and prejudiced against Asian people. You could be Asian and prejudiced. You could be Black and prejudiced against white people. Prejudice is something that any individual can have to another group. But when that prejudice is supported by systems and structures which give it the power to impact a person's life, that's when we call it an ism. That's when we call it racism. When a prejudice against race gets embodied and institutionalized in our system. And so it's very different, for example, for those of us who are white who may have people we work with who are prejudiced against us, because it's not likely that your system does that to all white people in the system or even most white people in the system. But if you're African American and you're working in a system where you encounter that kind of prejudice, it's often, more often than not, likely because of your group identity. And not only that, but that if you go to almost any other system, you're likely to encounter that same pattern because almost all systems are dominated by white culture, by white normative behavior, by white people. So when people say that Black people can't be racist against white people, they're not saying they can't be prejudiced against white people. They're not saying they can't have biases against white people. They're simply saying that the structure that they live and work in doesn't necessarily support those points of view. Now, there are exceptions to that. For example, if somebody went to work at Black Entertainment Network, and they were the only white person in a system of hundreds of people who were predominantly African American, we might say that there's some organizational racism in that system. But those circumstances are so few and far between that they almost aren't worth considering as part of the paradigm. So I hope that's helpful.
And other questions that are coming up for folks, go ahead and type them into the chat. This is a lot of information. And it can be overwhelming. So I just want to make sure that people are, if there are questions that are pertinent. I saw that Charles and Jen had shared a link also.
Yeah. Actually, one thing while we're waiting, sure. I would think about one other aspect of this before we dive in, before people, or before you do your piece, Penelope, and that's guilt. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the challenges that we've had is a lot of the work that we've done around this issue has traded primarily on the currency of guilt. So, and I have to say, as somebody, you know, who's in the diversity and inclusion community, professional community, that's been all too often what we've done. The problem is that guilt is a pretty dysfunctional human emotion. It creates contraction. You know, you think about it. If somebody in your life makes you feel guilty, do you want to be around them more or less? You know, for most of us, it's usually a pretty obvious answer to that. So we're not going to do what we don't want to do. We're not interested in encouraging people to be guilty, but rather trying to encourage them to take responsibility. You know, my family wasn't even here when slavery happened because my family are Jewish immigrants who came over in the 20th century. But it doesn't matter because I've benefited from white supremacy in this culture. I benefited from the privilege and entitlement of being white, particularly a tall white man. And I need to be responsible for that. And there are ways that the way I could be responsible for that is, of course, in many ways by being first of all, owning it, and then secondly, by being an effective ally. So,
yeah, and that's perfect segue into the content that. Excuse me. Whoops. Sure. Okay, playing. All right. So I've been very deeply involved in the reevaluation community. And in reevaluation counseling, we've dove in very deep into all the isms, into the institutionalized piece of this. So from sexism, classism, racism, all of it combining. And one of the things that I've really appreciated about that is exactly what Howard just said. So my first Eliminating White Racism workshop that I went to, the pamphlet that it wasn't just a pamphlet, it was a whole packet that we were given to get educated and to read. Right across, we're not to blame, but we are responsible. And one of the things that I know that gets in the way of action is when we're feeling awful about ourselves. So whether or not we've leaned in and paid attention here in the ways that Howard and I have our whole lives, like I feel so blessed. I was raised by a very radical minister who was like, God is in the streets. He actually left the church because he felt like people were just doing time on Sunday and not actually being in action. And so we were spoon-fed on, let your sins be those of commission, not omission. And I feel very grateful for that. You know, as a little one, I mean, like 7 years old, I went to my first civil rights march. I mean, it's just like, you know, it's just something that was just part of my culture. And I feel so grateful for that. But with that came, as Howard says, big feelings of guilt, embarrassment. Most of us here came from a culture where there was a lot of humiliation and shaming in front of other people because it was one of the ways that we were taught to be controlled. Don't speak up, feel bad about yourself. You know, it was like the whole thing about how dare you do something like that, get smacked, and then go to your room until you're over that. I don't know if this sounds familiar to any of you, but this is like how our brains were trained. And so we're feeling bad. We also know that it's not right. None of us wanted it. You know, my granddaughter's 7. She's in a school that's 10% white. There wasn't any issue for her until she hit about 5 years old. And that's when it started really coming down hard about you're ugly. You're like just her getting really slammed. And with our children, it's just, it's so egregious because we can feel it in our bodies that it's just not right. It doesn't make any sense. And when I was talking with one of my dear friends this week, an African heritage woman, I said, what do you want your white allies to know? Like, you know, I'm doing this work. What is it that you want us to know? And her first kind of anguish out of her, just like her whole body, was why? I don't understand. Why? You know, so we're all living in it. This is the pool that we were born into. And we're terrified about making mistakes. And my place of freedom was finally, I'm going to fuck up and make mistakes. And if I'm lucky enough to have someone of the global majority say, you just blew it, it's like, thank you for telling me. So one of the things is I want to give you guys permission to make mistakes. It's going to be messy. We're all making messes right now. And I know that the people in my life who are part of the global majority, it's like the more I've gotten woke to all of this, it's like, wow, you guys are so freaking generous with our lack of skill and awareness here. So for us as white allies, it's like, for me as a psychologist, for someone who's into the neuropsychology of how do you keep being in action in the face of all of this, I just want to talk a little bit about how we're set up to not act, how we're set up to go numb and just not look. And part of that has to do with all of us came in good. Every single human being, every single one of you have been around an infant. You know, you look at those little beings, it's like they're not coming in with these ideas, with these thoughts, with these patterns of behavior. None of us. And we tried like hell to get the contact that we needed. And we failed. We couldn't possibly win against the strength of adults around us. We couldn't possibly win to get them to come in to pick us up from the crib if we were crying. I was in the Dr. Spock generation where it was like, you do not pick up a crying child. You leave them there and cry. Okay, that's this thing where we fought like hell to have contact and get, and what we're on top of right now is these feelings of resignation and despair and hopelessness and helplessness. Does this sound familiar? Are you guys like feeling any of these feelings? Yeah. So my work with my clients and with the groups that I'm leading is we have to have one foot in the history of what's the genesis of this feeling of hopelessness. Because when we're discharging that, when we're moving through that, when we have an awareness of I failed, I was completely good, I fought like hell, and I failed. If I'm aware of that work, then I'm able to like come present time and say, is that true now? It's not. But the feelings of helplessness and this is too big, we're all carrying in our bodies. Okay, so that's a piece of what we have to deal with. I'm thrilled. I don't know if you guys have been seeing what the New York Times bestseller list looks like this week, but I never thought that we were going to see the kind of uprising that's happening right now. I did not think it was going to happen in my lifetime. So I'm thrilled, even though I knew that the revolution is fucking violent. It's messy, terrifying. So we as white people, as allies, need to really hold on to we're not to blame. And as Howard was saying, it's like it doesn't serve any of us to be walking around guilt-filled and shame-filled. And it does several things. Like he said, it drives people away. It also keeps us hiding out. We want to go away. We don't want to lean in. We don't want to look. It keeps us feeling bad about ourselves, and it keeps us in our younger states psychologically. It doesn't keep us in our adult moving in, leaning in. I have choice and I can do something here. So in RC, we talk about think, act, discharge. And then it's a circle. So really inviting people to think. That's what Howard's doing. That's what he's been, it's like thinking. Then what are out of that thoughtfulness, what are the actions that actually make sense? And keep discharging our emotions so that we can think, because the neuropsychology of emotions is this is a physiological event. Our feelings are a physiological event. We can't think our way through them. So do your own inner work to keep moving through the big feelings so that you can free up your brain so you can make decisions. It was after a huge session that I had in an LGBTQ workshop 10 days ago, where it was like, well, within my capacity of recovering from COVID and what's happening in my life and what's going on, what could I actually do here? And the first thought was, ask Howard to do an eliminating white racism workshop. So I texted him, I said, hey, you want to do this? And he was like, sure. But that literally came out of me discharging some really big feelings. And then I was able to think, act, have more discharge to do because it's terrifying to step up here. I was terrified to come into this work today, this workshop. It was scary. I'm not so much now. I'm thrilled. My biggest fear was that nobody would show up. And so that's like one really big piece about get that you're not to blame for the condition that we're in, and we are absolutely responsible for being in action. We are absolutely responsible for interrupting what's going on.
Now, can I interject for just a minute before we get too far away from what you were talking about shame? There's another piece to it that neither one of us has spoken to that I think is really important, and that is that when we are wallowing in our shame and guilt as white people about this, and there are a lot of times what can happen is we go to people of color asking for their forgiveness.
Oh, that was my next piece.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go for it. No, it's like, don't fucking be excuse me. I'm just going to drop F-bombs all the time. Okay. I'm just going to do it. It's like, don't counsel. Don't expect people of color to be your counselor.
That's right.
They're exhausted.
To take care of us at those times.
And this is what happens. Out of our guilt, we're like, I'm so sorry I did that. So the next piece, and it was like, write it down. I see lots of you writing this down. If you're lucky enough to have someone say you just made a mistake, or if you just made an egregious mistake because you're getting more educated, there's a 4-part process to this. Say, thank you for telling me. Say, I'm sorry I did that. Say, I'm going to go work on it and go work on it. Okay? And then say, and I won't do that again. But they don't need to be counseling us. My daughter, the Anarchist, was like, you need to have someone of the global majority running that workshop. And I said, hell no, they don't need to counsel our asses. No. And Danielle went, oh, yeah, okay, got it. This is our work. I made a decision. I'm running a group of women as transformational leaders, and I made a decision before this whole thing blew up that I was only going to invite white women leaders into it because I want to work on oppressor material. I want to work on our privilege. And it's hard to really lean into where it is we've made mistakes if we're feeling bad about ourselves. As Howard's been saying, it's like if we are feeling awful about ourselves, it's hard to really take a look at, I'm being oppressive. I'm being dominating. I mean, I've done work with men. How do I be an ally to a man through this whole thing? And how you're an ally to someone who's oppressing you. And this is something I've been talking about with some of the mixed groups I've been in, is say, please don't talk to me like that. That's not okay. And I'm not going anywhere. Because what we tend to do is we either just go away without setting a boundary and then we've been ghosted, or we set the boundary, cut off their heads, and go away again. And what our work is right now is to set the boundary and stay. And that's what we have to do with each other. It's so easy to blame each other for the egregious racism that's around us. And one of the hardest things is to lean in when we see somebody doing that. Other thoughts, Howard?
No, I think that's good for now. I'd love to give people a chance to go and talk, and then come back afterwards and see. There are a couple of great questions. Maybe we can just see if a couple of them.
Let's look at the chat. Why don't you go ahead and answer some in the chat?
Answer a couple of these questions quickly before we go. Glenn says, something I posted in the Facebook community recently as a Gestaltist, I realize there's so much emotion surrounding this time in our lives right now that it's easy to misinterpret the written word based on our background, the messages we heard as children, and the trauma we feel. We listen and we learn. That's so important, Glenn, that we do. We interpret the same thing differently. I mean, we see this in terms of people looking at the rage on the streets and the different interpretations. One is people in pain, the other is thugs. And there's an important distinction between the two. It doesn't make burning, when you realize it's people in pain, it doesn't mean burning down buildings or harming people is right. It doesn't mean that you're saying that's a good thing, but it's a different explanation when people do things out of their pain than when they're just opportunistic thugs. And we also have to be honest, the fact that there are some people who play out their sociopathy at times like this, use it to steal or things like that. And that's true as well, but it doesn't diminish everybody else. So thanks for that. Andrew says, what can you tell us about trauma caused by internalized racial superiority? It seems nearly all of my coaching clients are oppressed by their own unresolved trauma, pain, and therefore end up oppressing others in everything from bias to reverse racism and outright hatred for BIPOCs. Are you way up? No, not at all. In fact, I would say, Andrew, that one of the most insidious aspects of systematized racism is that it convinces people in the group to believe that they're less than, is the internalized, what we used to call internalized oppression. Now people are also often calling stereotype threat. There's a extraordinary academic, Claude Steele. Some of you may be familiar with Dr. Steele. I think he's now the provost or something at Stanford, but he was at NYU for a while, or Columbia rather. But in any case, he did this just remarkable research project where he gave African-American young people, before they took the SAT tests, the Scholastic Aptitude tests, he had half of them fill in one additional blank that asked them their race. That was all it did. The only thing was different. Everything else was the same, but for half of them, it said, in addition to your name, address, all that stuff, it said race. The people who filled in their race before taking the test on average scored between 150 and 150 points lower than people who didn't. Just being reminded before they took the test of their racial identity lowered their performance levels. So this is a huge issue. And of course, as soon as we start diminishing ourselves, the only way we can justify that is by diminishing other people like that. So if I diminish myself for being Black or for being Jewish or for being a woman or for whatever else, I'm likely to also have that same criticism about other people in that same group. In my same group. So Steele, S-T-E-E-L-E, I believe is the way it's pronounced, Christine. The difference between, here's Aileen, yes, Aileen asked, for another conversation, I'd like to understand the difference between anti-Semitism and racism. Seems like anti-Semitism is even more lethal and been around for centuries. I am, frankly, Aileen, avoid the oppression Olympics. We have this sort of oppression Olympics we get in, like, whose is worse? Mine is worse than yours. I think that anti-Semitism, racism, if you look at what happened in Northern Ireland, it was prejudice based on religion. You look at what happened in Rwanda, it was prejudice based on tribalism. I think that we've established that human beings can otherize almost any group of people, and it can get violent. I think that, anti-Semitism obviously could be systematized. We saw that during the Holocaust and in other places. And it's embedded. But I think different cultures just have different, different levels where people get lower or higher on that spectrum of otherization. So it's all hate in its various forms. So
I also would like to speak to something that Heidi posted, thank you, about reaching out to people of the global majority and our Black friends and neighbors right now. Everybody's really re-stimulated. There's a huge amount of feelings. There's one of the things that I know from my history in counseling, when you finally get a need met, all the feelings of not having that need met come up. So one of the things that a lot of Black people are experiencing right now is they're actually seeing white people step up and put their bodies out there. And it's bringing up a huge amount of feelings. So if you're not already close with people of the global majority, be friendly, smile, but don't be reaching hard towards them right now. Be warm, show up, look benign, be warm, let them come to you. Okay.
For yourself as an invitation. Might be putting it.
Yeah. And it's like, go on. What?
I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry.
No, that's okay. The other piece is, for those in my life, I've been sending like sweet emojis of love. Not even, it's like, I'm here. There was like a kitten massaging another kitten. I've been sending that to all my buddies. And people are loving that I'm reaching out. They don't want to process right now, but they know that I'm here, and then I'll get a text, one of my Black doctor buddies, and she, sent me a heart when I sent her the kitties. And then 3 hours later, just before bed, and she said, she just texted me saying, I'm just so tired. And as Howard said, this has been going on day after day after day, their entire lives. And so there's just a great deal of sensitivity that needs to happen right now when reaching towards people.
Yeah. And by the way, being a member of minority or underrepresented or non-dominant group yourself doesn't in any way give you, a lot of people say, well, I understand, I did a lot of work. One of my clients was the Human Rights Campaign, and I was actually on their diversity advisory board for 10 years, the external diversity advisory board. And, there's a lot of communication in that community because people say, well, as LGBT people, we understand oppression, but it didn't stop people from being race-based in their decision-making in the organization or having racist tendencies, because understanding oppression in one domain doesn't mean you can't be an oppressor in another. I know tons of people who rail against anti-Semitism who are Jewish, but then make questionable racial comments, and tons of African Americans I've known who make questionable homophobic comments, and tons of gay folks I know who make questionable comments about immigrants. But anybody who got something going on with somebody? It's our nature to otherize. So this is one of the fundamental natures of who we are as human beings, that we divide people between us and them in order to survive. So we'll come back after the conversation and talk a little bit more specifically about things that we can do as allies. Why don't we, Penelope, send people into conversation?
Yeah, so I'm going to send you into conversations. You're each going to get 5 minutes. So I'll be posting 5 minutes up, but keep a timer if you want. And this is a think and listen. And what that means is you're not questioning, you're not like responding. I want you to just really listen to each other. Okay, that's what we're doing. And it's like, and if it just 5 minutes seems like a long time, it is on some levels. And in others, it's like, what else is there? Is there anything else? So those of you in the room together, to say, is there anything else? So what's coming up for you in the discussion? What's been coming up for you this last week? What is coming up for you when you think about being in action in some way? Okay, is it making sense? Good. So we have just 15 minutes. I know there's a lot. I want to find out a little bit. So write in the chat about what the breakout rooms were like.
Yeah. Let's make sure we have 5 minutes, because I want to share some of these things for people to kind of actively do as sponsors. Okay. Good.
Absolutely. And then the other piece is, Aline and I were talking about it. I'm going to be offering once a month White Allies group for us to come together and just keep engaging. And so if you're interested in that, please send me an email. And I'm going to put my email in the chat because we're doing this on Zoom. So it's like I did not get anybody's contact information. I just did it. So I'm going to go ahead and just put my email here. And then just say that you want the recording or you want to be part of the White Allies group. Just go ahead and email me. And what it is pb@penelopebellcoaching.com. So I wanted to make sure that you had that information. If you have follow-up questions for either me and Howard, you can also find us on Facebook. We are as available as rational to be. And
maybe a little more than it's rational.
Yeah, well, there's that. Yeah.
Penelope, I noticed that some people are saying they're going to have to leave soon. So if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in. I just want to share this thing for people before they leave. So just these are some tips of things to do to continue to be a better ally. The first is to work on your own defensiveness. We developed this sense of white fragility. Robin DiAngelo coined that term, and if you haven't read her book, White Fragility, I recommend it. It's not perfect, but it's really very insightful. It's gotten to the point in our culture where being called a racist to some people is worse than actually being one. So we need to be able to work on our own defensiveness if we're going to be with people so that we can take stuff in and not have it be personalized. Because unless you woke up in the morning and said, I've decided to hate people today, then you're part of the system. You're not choosing that. The second is to put yourself in a learning mode. They're amazing. Susan and I were just talking about this. There are amazing resources available. I mean, my book, Everyday Bias, the second edition is coming out in just a couple of weeks. If you're interested in that, like I said, Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, is great. Anything written by Ibram Kendi. He broke, I think his latest book is a guide to anti-racism or something like that. But Ibram X. Kendi is amazing. And there are lots of other good people out there you can watch. Even popular TV, there's this great show on Netflix called Dear White People, which is done by Barry Jenkins, who made Moonlight and who directed Moonlight. And it's a great window into the life of Black college students in this fictional Ivy League school where you really get a sense of what life is like. So to do that, listen rather than speaking is so important in these conversations with people of color, and to really get their experience and not have to feel like you need to make it better or justify it, but just to really get it. Another one is to, and especially, and this is in the context, Penelope talked about this, but to reinforce, to allow people to feel what they're feeling. I was sharing with Sue, I had a conversation last night with a young woman, 26-year-old African-American woman who used to be my assistant before I sold my company. And we love each other dearly. And when I reached out to her this week to see how she was, she just said she was struggling. So I called and I just sat and listened to her for 20 minutes as she raged. And it was incredibly valuable for me and incredibly healing for her. So that's incredibly important. Demonstrate your support. Get I have it in the other room, but if you wear a mask, get one that says Black Lives Matter. Get a hat that says Black Lives Matter. Get a shirt. We had a huge banner on our house. Just make it clear to people that they're white people who support this movement, and that's all part of doing our own work. And at the core of this is to be willing to be uncomfortable, and to be willing to speak up even when you're uncomfortable. You don't have to have all the answers to speak up. Your speaking up can be, I don't have all the answers, and I'm really working to try to find some of them. But it's all about relationship. And then finally, don't forget to take care of yourself. Self-care is incredibly important, and come back to your meditation practice, come back to your centering place, because it's from that place that we can make our healthiest choices. So, I see John. John, hi. John George. Nice to see you, man.
Speak up, show up, stand up. Somebody was showing their sign, which is amazing.
Look at that. Speak up, show up, stand up. Black Lives Matter. Excellent.
And then I'm going to post it again. I'm going to post right now. There's a link in here for a Google document that is all about anti-racism, and it has a lot of the books that Howard just talked about, as well as shows, as well as things. So go ahead and click on that and get that into your browser so that you can take a look. My friend Molly Mandelblood put that up. It's an anti-racism document, and also how to raise anti-racist children. So there's a lot of resources in the document. I've just posted the link to. Howard, thank you again so much for your huge yes.
My pleasure. It's been a weird week. I said to Penelope, I got a call from Capital One last Wednesday, and they said, can you do a session for us on Monday? So set up a session with my dear friend and mentor, Dr. Janetta Cole, who some of you may know. She's now the current president of the National Council of Negro Women, 83 years old, amazing icon in the African-American community. So we signed up to do this thing. They said they hoped that, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people would sign up. So we did it Monday afternoon, and 22,700 people signed into the call.
Wow.
Just speaks to people are hungry.
Yeah.
For all this.
Yeah, I know. Isn't that great, John Joseph? It's so exciting. It's really exciting.
Oh my God, what am I going to say? The 22,000 people will hold me accountable for, It's like, you think you were nervous, kiddo.
So thank you all showing up like you did today and like you are in your lives. I know you're showing up in other places too. This counts. It's huge. It's so important for us to lean in and lock arms and be with each other. So
can I have one more minute? I just thought of something else I wanted to share. I'm so sorry, but it just popped into my mind, but I think it's a perfect kind of place to end. And that is, back in 1988, I met a woman named Alice Locke Kahana. I saw her being interviewed. Actually, I was participating in the Landmark Education Network at the time, and Werner Erhard conducted an interview with her on screen. And so I was so moved by her that I called her and we became friends. She was a Holocaust survivor who was in Bergen-Belsen. And at the age of 14 in the concentration camps, she conducted Sabbath ceremonies for the children because she didn't want them to forget their culture. Now, think about that. That was a death sentence if she would have gotten caught. Eventually, when the Russians were coming, the Nazis pulled the folks who were in those camps and marched them inland, marched them away from the Russians, and they marched through villages into Germany. And she said, so we became very dear friends. And she's an amazing artist, by the way. You can look at her art. And Chana was her name. She died about 2 years ago. And she said to me at some point, she said, in my entire experience, one of the most traumatic parts of it was after all the camps we were on that march, we left the camp, people were dying on the march left and right. They called them death marches. And she said, we would walk through these villages. And one of the most horrific things I remember is that as we walked through these villages, people would close their windows. They didn't want to see us. So what I want to leave you with is leave your windows open. Don't turn away. Even if it's painful, don't turn away. Even if you get sick and tired of watching it and sick and tired of watching the politicians, don't turn away, because Black people cannot turn away. They don't have that right to turn away. They have to live with it every day. And so the very least we could do is to stay present to what's going on and keep our windows open. Thank you all so much. It's such a gift to be able to be with you. Thank you,
Howard.
Thank you. Thank God, yes, and vote.
Okay. So taking
and vote. That's right. And vote. Thank you, Aileen.
Yeah, and vote. Vote. Yeah. Love you all very, very much. Please reach out. Please let me know if you want to do ongoing work, and let me know if there's any way that we can support you. All right. So good to see you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll also get this edited and get the recordings too if you send me an email. Okay.
Thank you, Penelope.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Penelope, for organizing this.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.